Hey everybody, welcome to the channel. I'm Fox, and today I wanted to revisit my original Spotter in Sync AR build. For those of you that have been with my channel for a while, you may remember that I posted a 4 blue variant of this build before it was even meta a long time ago, and that video did very well because at the time that meta was, well, it did since emerge, and you know, Spotter and In Sync with Vigilance are a very powerful combo even to date. But what you may have noticed lately is in the DZ in particular, you'll see a lot of 4 blue AR builds with either Spotter, Obliterate or Unbreakable, typically with Vigilance or Companion, and these work really well. So when I originally sort of looked at this combination and I put it together as 4 blue, I stated that if you spec it in the right way, you can have enough separate weapon damage buffs that kind of negate the fact that you have such high armor. So this means that even with 1.5 million armor, you're still going to have a ridiculous amount of weapon damage as well. What I'm going to do today is show you how to spec the build to make sure that you can achieve this high weapon damage, the best weapons to go for, including the best skills, and then what I'll do is I'll load into a conflict game, just solo, so you can see exactly how this build all plays out. Just before we get into the build, I do want to thank you all again for the continued support of the channel. We were able to hit 6k subscribers on Boxing Day, and we're already just a couple of dozen off of 7,000, you know, as of today's date in the middle of January. So, you know, I just want to thank you all from the bottom of my heart for the continued support of the channel. It wouldn't have been possible without you guys. So, yeah, it's been awesome. Thanks again. Okay, so let's start by having a look at the build. What we're doing is, of course, using Technician for the linked laser underbarrel, which is very important for a spotter build. Now, you don't need this if you want to run a different chest talent, but spotter is still my favourite, particularly with the foul, as it's a low rate of fire and doesn't benefit from Obliterate as much as I'd like. This gives us the +1 skill tier as well, which in conjunction with the 4 blue on our build means that our shield is actually tier 5, which is very useful for an in-sync build, as it is the main source of proccing that particular talent. The 3 weapons that I would highly recommend that you consider if you're looking to run a spotter variant, so essentially these weapons need to have the long underbarrel rail. If you look on the right hand side there, the third option down in the mods, it says long underbarrel rail, and of course I've got that linked laser pointer equipped. The best DPS choice is the Police M4, the second is the FAL, and then the third and final is the Carbine 7. Now, I don't like the recoil of the Police M4, though the rate of fire is fantastic and it works well with Obliterate. The Carbine is one of the best ARs in the game. It's incredibly well rounded, but it is a pain to farm for. So my personal favourite, purely for the weapon handling and range stats, is the FAL. This thing hits like an absolute truck and it is a headshot magnet. You all know my love for the FAL. I don't shut up about it in any PvP video I do ever, and that love has not died off even a little bit. Whichever AR you go for, you need to be speccing into damage to targets out of cover. So because this build has 4 blues, it's very important that we utilise 2 important stats or attributes. Damage to targets out of cover, of course, and damage to armour. Damage to targets out of cover, sorry, is a multiplicative stat like damage to armour, but it works against basically everything in game. Agents, whether they're in their armour or their health, their shields and their skills. So if they've got a shield up, if there's a mortar turret, if there's just somebody coming at you, it's just a multiplicative damage talent or stat that gives you a buff, even though we only have 2 reds on the build. So that is very important to get that as your minor attribute. And then of course In Sync is a must. If you want the best weapon damage, unfortunately there's still no better talent. This is just 30% additional weapon damage completely free of charge. I'm sure one day this will be nerfed to make other talents actually viable again, like Optimist, but as it stands you need to be speccing into In Sync if you want the best damage from a 4 blue build. My secondary is a close range weapon. The military M870 is one of the single best, if not the best, close range weapon in the game, outside of course, the exotic Lady Death SMG. But because we'll be swapping to this weapon, the Lady Death is not a good choice as we won't have any stacks. And I have got Optimist on this, as when I'm swapping over to another weapon, it usually means I'm in the middle of a fight and I don't want to keep redeploying my shield. I'm just going to use Optimist here to gain some weapon damage buffs straight away. Once again, as you can see, this is spec'd into damage to targets out of cover. And then finally we're running the DZ exclusive orbit, as this gives us the perfect finisher. If I run out of bullets on my AR and they're very low health, I will actually just swap to this instead, get the kill and give myself a ridiculous amount of additional crit chance and crit damage for 15 seconds. So it just depends on which of these 2 weapons I'll swap to, depending on the kind of fight that I'm in. You kind of have to make that decision on the fly. Looking at our armour pieces, there are some very specific pieces that you need here. Now, if you're lucky enough to get a backpack or chest that you can roll to blue that already has crit chance, crit damage, and the relevant talent that you want, then do it, because Coyote's Mask would be the best thing to have on this build, but to keep it at 4 blue, it's nearly impossible to do that. What you need to have is 2 pieces of Walker and Harris, Contractor's Gloves and Fox's Prayer, and Fenris. and then my final piece is simply Seska to make sure that I'm close to the crit chance cap. The 2-piece Walker and Harris gives us 5% weapon damage, which is important for a build that only has 2 red, but maybe more importantly it gives us 5% damage to armor. This means that we do a multiplicative additional amount of damage to any agent that is within armor, but it also, for those of you that don't know this, damage to armor does apply to enemy shields, as does damage to targets out of cover. Even though they show a health bar, damage to health only affects deployed skills such as hives and mortar turrets, and as this is an AR build, we already have 21% for that anyway, so we don't need to worry about that. So the 2-piece Walker and Harris is better than Seska Grupo, 3-piece Providence. I've tested all variations. It just does more damage with the multiplicative damage bonuses on a high blue build such as this, and I highly recommend that you get farming for some Walker and Harris. You want to spec into crit chance and crit damage on every single piece in this build where it is applicable. My chest piece unfortunately did come with armor regen, which isn't the end of the world. I've definitely seen worse stats here, at least it's not health. But ideally I would like crit damage on here, so there's a bit of work I need to do on this build. But this has weapon damage, crit chance, and the armor regen. Spotter is my talent of choice here. It's still my favourite out of the 3 main damage talents, namely Glass Cannon, Obliterate, and of course Spotter. And it works very well with a low rate of fire AR such as the FAL, which of course is only 650 rounds per minute. Certainly a lot slower than the Police M4 at 850 and the FAMAS at 900. What Spotter essentially does is buff both our weapon and skill damage by 15%, and this is an amplified damage bonus. So this is the stat that applies at the end of the damage equation. The game will calculate your base damage, your headshot damage, crit damage, all of your multiplicative damages, and finally any amplified damage stats. So it just has the biggest bonus in the game if it says the word amplified. If it says increases total weapon damage, that's still multiplicative, but it is applied early in the equation and therefore equates to less damage. So Spotter is fantastic, but by all means, if you prefer, just go Obliterate, and then you could potentially run a different specialisation such as Firewall or Gunner. This is also great because I'm using a damaging skill to keep in-sync proc, which I'll come to in a second. My holster is a blue rolled Seska, just to flesh out my crit chance. It comes with 10% by default, and as you can see, this has crit chance and crit damage rolled to it, so I just re-rolled this to blue as one of my 4. The 2 probably most important parts of the build outside the double walker are Fox's Prayer. This is an absolute must on any DPS build in the game for that matter, and Contractors is a very close second. But as this build relies on having a lot of multiplicative damage buffs to make up for the fact we only have 2 reds, the damage to armor that you gain from Contractors and the damage to targets out of cover that you gain from Fox's Prayer are quite simply the best damage talents and gear pieces in slot for this build. Yes, something like Sawyers could obviously do more damage for your knees, but you don't want to be sat in cover for 10 seconds. That makes no sense in a PvP environment for the most part. So these 2 are a must for this build, and I highly recommend that you get a blue rolled Contractors and Foxes. I have crit damage on one and crit chance on the other. Just, whatever you need to hit that 60 chance cap first. And then the Fenris is also very important, as once again this gives us another damage buff that we don't have a huge amount of outside of the 2 reds. So this is 10% assault rifle damage, and as you can see I've spec this to crit chance and crit damage as well, with Vigilance as the talent. Vigilance is still one of the best talents in slot for an AR build because you usually play these from range, and if you're using a shield and your opposition hits your shield, or you have bonus armor from a boost crate that's been picked up in conflict, for example, then actually that doesn't lose Vigilance. It only loses the buff if your personal armor takes damage. So you can retain this for quite long periods of time if you run a shield and you're strafing well so that the enemy can't hit your head. This is just a total 25% weapon damage buff, so it's amazing if you get the first few shots on an enemy. The skills that we are using are the Crusader Shield. Whilst this now has a 5x modifier, taking damage modifier, that is, in PvP. This has 4 million HP, and this is of course tier 5 with the plus 4 blue on the build and the plus 1 skill tier from Technician. So this still has a lot of health. It has great holstered regeneration and active regen because of the skill tier, and an absolute must for an in-sync build. I know there are people out there that don't like shields and they think they're cheesy, but honestly I'm going to have to disagree with that, and I'm sure this video will get some dislikes. But when people use a shield, they can't dodge roll, you can stagger them, and they can't strafe. So there are, as long as you're landing headshots, it's actually easier to land headshots when somebody's using a shield than without, as they're less agile. And if you want to break through their shield, which with all the damage to armor we can do, you're going to stagger them, which basically cleans up the kill. The same thing applies to us, so shields are not overpowered. They are strong to proc in sync, but they are very, very easy to break in the current sandbox. The secondary skill you can swap out. Decoy is probably best in slot for Dark Zone plays, but I like to strike a drone for 2 reasons. One, it is well, actually 3 reasons. It's a constant proc for in sync, as every bullet applied resets the timer, which means we're going to gain that 30% damage more of the time, and that means if our shield breaks we have our drone, and if our drone breaks we have our shield. So we have 2 sources of in sync proc. 2, the damage is buffed by the +1 skill tier from the Technician and Spotter, as this is an amplified damage bonus to pulsed enemies for skills and weapon damage. And 3, it acts like a radar. Yes, of course, we can pulse enemies just by looking at them with our weapon, with that link laser underbarrel attachment. But what this essentially does is highlight the button that it is assigned to. On my case with Xbox, it's right bumper, even if it's right at the peripheral of your vision. So there'll be times when there'll be an enemy in cover to the side and you won't even see them, but all of a sudden you'll see a massive right bumper or R2 or whatever hotkey you got it assigned to on PC that just essentially highlights them. You can quickly send your drone over to them and start working them down. So a very, very useful skill. But if you prefer to use the EMP sticky bomb, that's a fantastic skill. The decoy as well, or the booster hive to prevent a lot of Hasbro to yourself. Luckily with the 4 blue we don't need it as much, but these are all viable second skills as well. And redeploying a hive and picking it up does proc in sync as well, so a great choice. My stats are as follows. Without any of the weapon buffs, we have for PvP basically 42k per shot, which is quite high. My crit chance isn't quite capped because some of my pieces are need a bit of optimization, but it's a bit too expensive at the moment. But we're pretty close at nearly 57%. As long as you're over 50%, that's generally fine. You're probably going to have coyotes in your party anyway. Crit chance is 125%. I know some of you out there would already say, oh, my AR build uses 3-piece Providence and I can hit 160% crit damage. I promise you that the double walker with the contractors and the foxes will equate to more damage on a 4 blue build than having 3-piece Providence or some Grupo in there, just because the damage to armor and damage to targets out of cover buff the base weapon damage, and therefore your crit damage is buffed on top of that. So even though it's only 125%, which may seem low, you're going to see in the comfort game just how hard this build hits. Headshot damage is 75%. That's pretty typical for this build, as most weapons, most ARs in game have a default value of 70%, so that's pretty standard. And then we have 13% damage to armor, which is ridiculous. That's incredibly high, and very good against teams that have a healer as well. And 21% health damage to break skills and enemies that are low. So those are the stats just there. You can see my armor is currently sat at 1.5 million, or to be precise, 1.474 million. Plenty of armor there to stay alive and keep our shield as tanky as possible. So what we'll now do is load into a conflict game, and I'm going to demonstrate exactly how this build all plays out. So it looks like we're loaded into a game quite late. Let's see how we get on. Hopefully this isn't over too quickly. If it is, I might include a second game at the end. So I like to pop the drone early because this is going to give me a little bit of extra information to see where the enemies are. There we go, just like that. Oh, look at those. Oh, I zoomed in there, didn't need to do that. So yeah, this build hits. Oh, where's my drone shooting? This was a bad play. Oh, as if you were using... Hip firing, hip firing. There you go, that is why the amount of blues that I have in this build is very important. Fortunately, we have a status user, which is not great at the best of times. You all know my dislike for them. That guy got schmelted. See you later, buddy.
The boost is being taken by allies. The boost has been taken by allies.
Not today, guy. Not today. Oh, look at the damage. 374k per shot. Yeah, you don't need, honestly, you do not need any more than the amount of reds that I have if you spec it in the correct way. Woo! Crazy damage. Even with my terrible accuracy, you can see just how fast it melts. So this is what I'm trying to say, is if you can have the full blue, as long as you spec heavily into damage to armor and damage to targets out of cover. If you can't quite get the rolls that I have with damage to targets on your weapon and foxes, and then damage to armor with the double walkers and contractors, then I would recommend that you go down to 3 blue just to make up for that. But if you can get all of those on the build, even with relatively low crit chance and crit damage stats, you will decimate your opposition. It works incredibly well. And look at that, I joined that game late and I was able to finish top. I can't wait to see the stats here. There you go. So I joined that game when there was only 7 lives left on the enemy team, plus the remaining 4, and I was able to close 9 kills without a single death. So this just highlights the strength of the build. You know, honestly, it works incredibly well. Yeah, I can't sort of praise the 4 blue variant enough. Please do try it out if you haven't already. Hopefully that showcased just how well it works. Let me know in the comments what you think and how you're running your AR build. And until then, I will see you all in the next video. Peace.